What is up, my Squirtleites? It is I, your king. Let's talk about E3 2018 as a whole, because there's quite a bit of stuff we can take away from everything that was talked about at E3. Now, I've already done my individual conference impressions, gone over the games that were talked about, so I'm just going to kind of focus on the fine points of each and every company's conference and what that kind of means going forward, and kind of, the attitude and the vibe we got from each conference. I'm going to list a single pro and con for each, and then also talk about the games that they showed that really stood out to me. There was at least one from every company, but I am going to completely omit EA from this entire discussion, because at this point I might as well be boycotting EA, because I just can't support them in any good faith or anything. So we're going to just completely ignore the fact that Electronic Arts exists for this video, just like I was for all of the conference impressions, and we're just going to talk about E3 as a whole and kind of what it means going forward, because I feel like the general consensus was that this was one of the slower E3s in recent memory. Definitely a weaker year as compared to other years where a lot of bombshells were dropped. A lot of conferences really focused on things we already knew about. I would say each conference maybe had at most two or three things to talk about that we didn't really know all that much about before, which, I mean, it's fine, but again, it was just kind of an E3 that was like, hey, here's an update on what's coming rather than here's new stuff, which I think is an obvious indicator that this console generation is starting to come to a close. There's been a lot of rumors floating around that probably next year both Microsoft and Sony are going to unveil their new consoles. I think Microsoft probably more likely than Sony. Sony might actually wait a little bit based on the way that they're going. But it was a slow year with hope for the future, I feel like. And again, the new console generation is coming, but I feel like with all of the customer expectations that have been built up over this last generation, that generation is going to really need to justify its existence, especially now that improvements are so marginal and so minimum that this next generation, I really don't know how it's going to be able to visually stand out from this generation. And I know we've said that with every generation. We look back on the consoles and go, oh, it looks so good. How are they going to improve these graphics? But we've actually hit a point where consoles are starting to achieve a parity with the way that PC is now in terms of actual visual fidelity. Obviously not necessarily technical quality, but in terms of the way games are being developed, they're sort of on par with one another in terms of the way they look. So that's not going to be the selling point for this next generation anymore. They're going to have to find other ways of justifying themselves, and they're going to have to keep up the customer goodwill if they want to be able to justify themselves. I'm talking things like bringing back backwards compatibility, and talking about things like really focusing on making sure that consumers have a good experience and have a good reason to jump on the next console, when honestly, as it's going right now, people really aren't all that fatigued over the PS4 and Xbox One at the moment, or at least not the PS4, and especially not the Switch, obviously, but that's kind of its own separate generation. So yeah, it's going to take a lot of work, and with that, rumors again of it being on the horizon, we're going to have to see how that pans out. But I think it's down years like this year are good indicators that is coming soon. So starting with Microsoft, my two games from their conference that I was the most intrigued by were Ori and the Will of the Wisps and Forza Horizon 4. Obviously, this is very personal bias, but Ori and the Will of the Wisps in particular was my favorite game talked about of the entirety of E3. I've said before that Ori and the Blind Forest is a fantastic game. I absolutely adore it. And Will of the Wisps in particular seems to do nothing but improve on the formula of the first game. Obviously, that remains to be seen in terms of other aspects that we can't glean from a demo, like level design and story and things like that. But in terms of the gameplay itself, and what I honestly think was the strongest point of the first game, it seems like a step up in every way, shape, or form, and it is the game that was talked about at E3 that I am anticipating the most. Now notice I am only talking about the exclusives in this conference. I'm not mentioning third-party games just because I feel like that isn't really fair when most of the stuff at Microsoft's conference was also on PC and PS4. So I'm not going to go over those things, but those were my two games from Microsoft. Now the pro I want to take away from Microsoft's conference and their presentation was the fact that it is clear that Microsoft is trying to earn that customer goodwill. They have been for the last couple of years now. They are, working on consumer-friendly ideas and practices. They are a cheaper end system than the PlayStation side of things. They are, working on better services for players. The Xbox Game Pass is leagues better of an idea than anything Sony can offer in terms of access to a game library. It's way better than what PlayStation Now, both in terms of value and in terms of the amount of games and the quality of games that it offers, because so much of the Game Pass stuff is current, while a lot of PlayStation Now stuff isn't. Xbox has really done its best to improve its Live Gold service, in comparison to Sony's PlayStation Plus service. Microsoft is really trying to earn that customer goodwill back, but that leads into my con, which is the fact that it's taken so long to even scratch the surface of customer goodwill again. They shot themselves in the foot so hard at the beginning of this generation that only just now are people starting to finally recognize that Microsoft is trying to do good by the consumer. And they are doing good by the consumer. I do feel like Microsoft at the moment isn't really too concerned with its console standing anymore. Don't forget, Microsoft isn't just a console manufacturer like Nintendo is. Neither is Sony, but Sony is very dependent on its console division. Microsoft, not as much. They have stakes in so many other things. And while, yes, I'm sure they really want to sell a lot of consoles, obviously, they're probably looking forward to the next generation. And they're trying to, again, build up that customer goodwill in anticipation of it. They're trying to look like the good guy once again. And I think they are doing, for the most part, a good job. It's just a shame that it's taken so long, and it's a shame that they really shot themselves in the foot at this generation, and I think that is the saddest part. But as it stands right now, Microsoft is kind of the voice of the video game industry overall, with so many of those games that they talked about in that conference being available on all platforms. And they weren't afraid to admit that either. It's not like they were trying to be like, this is exclusive. They were with certain games, of course, because exclusives are system sellers. But at the same time, they didn't seem too fussed by the fact that they also had cross-platform games, and they also had, games that just were good games and games that they just wanted people to be excited about. They cared about the games, and they cared about the games, I feel, far more than any other company did at E3 this year. Moving on to Bethesda, my two games of the show are definitely, without question, Fallout 76 and Doom Eternal. Fallout 76, as much as I love Fallout 4, the idea behind 76 does intrigue me. I do want to give it a shot, and I do really feel like Bethesda is doing a good job of trying to make the experience something that Fallout players would enjoy, and not trying to depart too much from the original series, retaining the charm and the dark humor and the feeling of Fallout, while at the same time making for a fun multiplayer experience that is separated from the rest of the series. And obviously, Doom Eternal is Doom Eternal. It's a sequel to Doom, which I personally think is the best first-person shooter of this generation, and I know there's a lot of people that mirror that. Doom was such a fantastic game in almost every single way, I would say, barring only the multiplayer, but most people didn't touch that anyway. And the fact that a sequel's coming out, there's really not a whole lot not to be excited about. Of course, they could always mess it up, but it's still something to be excited about nonetheless, because so far they're doing pretty darn good with it, and I feel like they kind of know what they need to do with that series. Now, my pro with Bethesda's conference, or the pro takeaway I can take from it, the positive takeaway, is the fact that Bethesda continues to demonstrate that as a publisher, it cares about its players more than any other AAA publisher. I'm not counting Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo. I feel like those are in its own separate category. But when we look at the Activisions and the EAs and the Ubisofts and the Bethesdas and the Bandai Namcos, Bethesda has a very personal and down-to-earth experience or relationship, I suppose, with its players. And even if, their quality control isn't always the best, and they do sometimes make very boneheaded decisions like the Creation Club, which, by the way, wasn't at E3 this year. They didn't mention it even once. Bethesda definitely does care about what its players think. Showed in no small part by their self-aware meme that with Keegan-Michael Key, where they announced Skyrim for the Alexa, followed by Skyrim for the Etch-a-Sketch, and so on and so forth. That was a wonderful skit, and it really did make me laugh. I thought it was hilarious, but I do think it does demonstrate that Bethesda they're still very down to earth. They're not big and corporate like so many other publishers. They are behind the scenes. There's no question about that. They are still a corporation. You can't ever forget that for a second when it comes to thinking about whether or not Bethesda is going to ever pull something on you. But they still do continue to demonstrate that they care the most in a lot of ways, and they care about feedback, and they care about what people say, and and I have to give them respect. At the same time, though, Bethesda, and this is the con I have, the negative takeaway I have from this, is that Bethesda also does show that it does have some sort of disconnect with its players. I feel like a lot of that was emulated in the first half of the Bethesda conference when they had things like the Andrew WK concert, and they started to, show some things that, really a lot of people don't honestly care about all that much. And then again, with decisions like the Creation Club that were made, I mean, I do think Bethesda showed that they are better. They're doing better this year, and they definitely are listening to the feedback. I just feel like Bethesda sometimes misinterprets that feedback, which every publisher does it. Every game developer does that. But I feel like Bethesda kind of still has the problem of coming off like the cool hip uncle who doesn't quite understand what the kids are trying to tell him sometimes. And I feel like Bethesda still has a lot to work on in regards to that. But for the most part, I honestly didn't have a whole lot of negative things to say about Bethesda. Square Enix, I have to say I am personally not an RPG fan, so I can't really talk about the games that were only just teased, so I can only pick one game from their conference that was a standout to me, and obviously that's going to be Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I love the Rise of the Tomb Raider game. I am very excited for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. If they can keep up with the quality that was in Rise of the Tomb Raider, I think this is going to make for one of the best action-adventure series around, just because Rise of the Tomb Raider set such a high bar and was such a fantastic game. The pro and the positive takeaway I have from Square Enix is that Square Enix, as a publisher, seems to still very much care about maintaining focus on its games. It's not trying to, shove in all this other crap, these games as services and things like that, like they almost did with something like Deus Ex Mankind, but at the same time, they're very much committed to just being a games publisher. And you might think, well, that's kind of a silly thing to say is a pro, but I really do mean that in the best of ways, that Square Enix is, one of those few publishers that is focused on single-player experiences, right alongside publishers like Bethesda, and I would also say Bandai Namco. That's the route that they're taking, and I feel like that is a net positive for the industry overall, that we still have publishers going to bat for those kinds of games, and especially the JRPG market. Like, I know Square Enix back last generation suddenly got very scared of JRPGs, and they didn't really want to go all out with their JRPGs, and they kind of, muddied around with it a bit, but now they seem to be a little bit more back to form. I mean, sure, they're a little bit more style over substance these days, but they're still, they're still trying to give players what they want, and I think that's what's important. However, the negative takeaway I obviously have from this conference is that Square Enix completely failed to justify its appearance as a conference at E3. Like, again, I have no idea why that was a conference. I have no idea why they couldn't have just left, half of those trailers in the Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo conferences, and then the other 3 trailers could have just been sprinkled throughout the show. That did seem a little bit silly to me, and I do think that was just... It kind of hurt the way that, it kind of hurt Square Enix's image just for the sheer fact that it was a terrible conference, when honestly, those game reveals probably would have been a lot less soured if people didn't have the expectations and the built-up hopes of a proper press conference going into it. So that is my negative for Square Enix. Now, Ubisoft does actually have a game that I was legitimately excited for, or I am legitimately excited for, despite all of my negative thoughts towards Ubisoft as a publisher, and that is Beyond Good and Evil 2. It looks good. I can't deny that it looks good. It looks like a great idea, and the guys that are behind it, the team that is working behind Beyond Good and Evil, they genuinely care about their game. They really do. They show that there's genuine passion there, which is something that's honestly, I mean, it's not rare in the video game industry, but it does seem like it's rare from a corporate standpoint. And, sure, they can pretend they care about something and then they really don't, but I get the feeling that these people really do. This is their baby project. They want this to succeed, and I do feel like, for the most part, it is safe in the hands of its developers. And I mean, obviously, again, don't pre-order it, but Beyond Good and Evil 2 is looking like the safest bet out of anything Ubisoft has revealed thus far. My positive takeaway in that regard for Ubisoft is that Ubisoft is making steps. based on last year's conference and this year's conference, Ubisoft is starting to make steps in caring about its games more and caring about its players more. They're trying to display that goodwill sort of in the way that Ubisoft always does, where it always is kind of surrounded by all sorts of other bullcrap, but they're still trying to do it nonetheless. It's like, it really is. It's like trying to take somebody who's, a habitual liar and then, trying to make them tell the honest truth right from the get-go, and they can't quite do it, but they're starting to make steps. But that also, ties into what I think is the negative part of Ubisoft, is that they're still totally, fully unable to justify themselves to us based on their history. They're not able to, they're not actually coming out and telling us that, they always say we're committed, but they never really demonstrate proof that they're committed to making better experiences, especially when you have, moments like the CEO just a couple weeks before E3 saying that console gaming is dead next generation and cloud gaming is the future, and anti-consumer things like that. When you've got them making statements like that, they still continue to reveal their hand as a very shady and untrustworthy publisher, and it just makes it impossible to get excited about anything that they actually do. Then we have Sony, and I do have 2 games that I'm going to pick for their conference. I was going to do 3, but I felt like since I've only done at most 2 with every other conference, I'll just stick with 2. And for me, those 2 games were Ghost of Tsushima and Control. I know, blasphemous. I didn't say certain other games, but maybe I'll save all that, my thoughts on that, for another video. But Ghost of Tsushima looks like something that's just right up my alley. It's something I'm absolutely excited for. It's kind of the game I've really always wanted, just a 3D action adventure samurai experience, and not necessarily in the vein of a Dark Souls style game, one where I actually feel like I can just pick it up and complete it in one day without throwing my controller across the room. And then Control, it's a Remedy game. I mean, Remedy's pretty high quality stuff. It looks really good. It looks very fascinating. It just looks like a trippy and interesting experience that I want to enjoy, and I feel like more so in the good way, in the good kind of trippy experience, rather than something like what David Cage does at Quantic Dream. So the pro, obviously, with Sony is that as of this entire generation, they are still very much setting the bar for consistent quality when it comes to their first-party releases. Obviously, they have had missteps here and there, but I feel like Sony this generation has achieved a level of consistent quality with their first-party releases. We're talking games like God of War, Horizon Zero Dawn, Uncharted 4, games like that is on the same level as what really only Nintendo's ever been known for in the past. I mean, and that's a good thing. And with this conference, they committed to, displaying themselves in that way, to showing that they care about the quality of their games. However, my big negative from Sony is that they are really starting to show off their arrogant side all over again, where they try to make their reveals, their reveals are starting to become increasingly more pretentious. They're becoming increasingly more arrogant, where they still don't show us anything and expect us to pre-order even without a release date. They're, pulling crap like they are with Fortnite right now, where they're not allowing for cross-platform play. Things like that, it's starting to show shades of, end of PS2 era Sony again, the same Sony that, eventually revealed the overpriced PS3 and completely tanked itself for an entire generation, and then found itself in the same position that Microsoft currently finds itself in. So it's like a repeating cycle, and I don't want Sony to fall back into that, but they're, last few years, and especially this year, they're really starting to show their hand in that regard, and I feel like that's something that we need to be very aware of and very, very cautious of with Sony, because they're prone to do it, and there's every reason to believe at the moment that they're going to do it again. And then there's Nintendo. Nintendo, for me, the 2 big highlights were definitely Super Mario Party, which looks like a return to form for the Mario Party series, but in an innovative way that almost looks, better than what we've seen from Mario Party, even in the distant past. And then, of course, Super Smash Bros. Universe. How can you not be excited for that? I'm absolutely excited for it. Despite the fact that it isn't an entirely new Smash Bros. Game, it is the culmination and definitive edition of what Smash Bros. Has really always needed to be. I mean, it's going to be Smash Brothers at its absolute finest until, well, obviously the next Smash Brothers comes out, which is awesome. I'm very excited for Smash Brothers Universe, and that's got to be part of my positive outlook on Nintendo, is the fact that the Switch is absolutely on fire, and that, with the amount of games that are coming out for it, especially with the number of companies that are turning to the Switch and going, yes, I want to put my game on there, it's good for consumers. The Switch is awesome. I mean, I can't not recommend it to people at this point. Aside from one thing, but we'll get into that in a second. But it's just doing so well, and it's got so many great games on the horizon, and it's just such a fantastic and phenomenal system. And Nintendo is, for the most part, doing an incredibly good job with it right out the gate. However, the negative thoughts on this is that Nintendo, even in this press conference, continued to show that they're still doing quote-unquote Nintendo things. And I'm talking about things like, the crap they pull with Amiibo, the crap they pull with all of their little collectibles, where things are just way more expensive than they should be. The peripherals are the biggest reason I can't recommend a Nintendo Switch to people, because if they ever are interested in anything beyond what's in the box, I have to break it to them that the console is a lot more expensive than they initially anticipated, because their peripherals are outrageously priced. Nintendo's still always, this isn't even like an up and down thing. They've always displayed a brand of their own unique arrogance, and they're still showing shades of that every now and then, and that always worries me. And as of right now, they're getting a lot of support, so I definitely don't want it to bite them in the butt, but there's always that small fear that it always could, depending on whether or not they decide to pull a really boneheaded move, like they are prone to do at times. So again, that is my biggest negative in terms of the Switch. And then, even to tack onto that, of Nintendo things, it's the fact that they are getting complacent with their library. I feel like they're afraid to take risks with a lot of their other IPs. Not taking risk isn't always a good thing, obviously, but I feel like they're so afraid to touch so many of their other IPs when they've got their series like Splatoon, Fire Emblem, and Xenoblade that have been carrying them over the last few years. It feels like that's all they really want to develop for, and then the occasional other side game in between. And I just feel like Nintendo can do so much more than that. Beyond just the small indies that they're supporting and things like that. I'm talking about their actual, first-party experiences. I feel like, we need more Super Mario Odysseys. We need more Metroid Prime 4s. We need more Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wilds. We need more of these heavy hitters that aren't all coming from the same franchise. And again, I feel like it's a very Nintendo move whenever they start to settle into a rhythm with a certain series, that they just kind of stick to that until it flops. And I don't want them to continue to do that with what they've got going on right now. So those are my overall thoughts on E3. I'm very excited for a lot of the games that are coming out this year, and as well as in 2019 and beyond. I am a little bit worried about the upcoming console generation, because it seems like it's right around the corner. Could be next year, possibly the year after, but from the sounds of it, next year is probably the most likely time we start to at least get the announcement or reveal of the next generation of Xbox and possibly Sony consoles. So it is a little bit worrisome, especially because, the current console generation definitely doesn't feel like it's in the same complacent and bad state that the PS3 and Xbox 360 were in before the PS4 and Xbox One were announced. But it feels almost like the industry is letting itself fall into that state when it doesn't really need to, when those systems or at least the PS4 is still going strong. So anyways, that is going to be it for this video. Thank you all so very much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed E3 as much as I did, or probably more. I certainly had my share of disappointments. If you were starry-eyed and loved every bit of it, more power to you. I couldn't be happier for you. So thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.